Hi, I'm Jim Kavanagh, known as the Polemicist online. You can follow me on Substack and Twitter at the Polemicist underscore, all linked below. I'm going to give a brief talk about what I think the situation is in Ukraine, what I think the prospects are, how dangerous I think it is, the turning point I think we're approaching, why I think we're actually at a greater risk of nuclear war than we've ever been, including during the Cuban Missile Crisis. To summarize and crystallize what I think the danger is, uh, I think that can be crystallized in a single question. Who will accept defeat? This is a fight of NATO, United States and NATO against Russia. It's a fight of existential importance for both sides, each of which has said it cannot accept defeat. Stoltenberg, the leader of NATO, has said very clearly Russia's victory in the war against Ukraine will be a defeat of NATO. This cannot be allowed. The German foreign minister says we're fighting a war against Russia. It's not just rhetoric, there are boots on the ground. Ukrainian POWs have said that in the Battle of Kharkiv, they would not, if the foreigners had not helped us, we would have disintegrated immediately. That means fighters from the USA, Poland, and Great Britain. And we've seen this in the Kramatorsk attack, where most of the casualties were American and British soldiers. So there are Americans and British and NATO, not only commanders and commanding and directing each battle, but soldiers on the ground. And this is, from the NATO point of view, this is a fight. To lose this battle would be a defeat that cannot be allowed. For his part, Putin has said that NATO is, and the United States openly say that Russia must be defeated on the battlefield, that and subsequently deprived of political, economic, cultural, and any other sovereignty, and ransacked. And that's the truth. He knows that if Russia is defeated, it will be open to being ransacked by the United States and the West. So for Putin too, he is saying that the victory of the adversary would be an existential defeat that cannot be allowed. As Manuel Todd, a French sociologist, has said, no more than Russia, America cannot withdraw from this conflict. They cannot let go. This is why we are now in a confrontation whose outcome must be the collapse of one or the other side. So, as he says, and I think it's true, the war will go on until one party accepts defeat, or until the world is incinerated in a nuclear exchange, which may be the more likely outcome. Nobody would win because nobody would accept defeat. Everybody will lose. So anyway, the US, the other problem here is now, at this point, the United States knows that Ukraine cannot win. They know, there was in one of my articles, the one, I think it's the zombie war article, I quote someone who wrote about a meeting he had with foreign policy leaders from all previous administrations, and they all agreed that Ukraine is not likely to defeat Russia, quote, even if the West makes the maximum efforts and risks escalation. But despite knowing that, the great majority of them favored, quote, risking everything for absolute victory over Russia. So the United States and NATO now are in the position where they know Ukraine cannot win, but they still insist that Russia must lose. So how can they thread that needle? How can that come about? At this point, with Ukraine's famous offensive doing so badly, and I think with the undeniable collapse, the imminent collapse of the Ukrainian army, as people like Scott Ritter, Douglas McGregor, Brian Berletic, Alexander Kuris, Moon of Alabama have said, it's clear now that the Ukraine army cannot be rebuilt for a third or fourth time. The United States and NATO have run out of their own material. And they're in a situation where they're facing what's going to be an undeniable collapse of the Ukrainian army, where it will be evident to the public as well as to them that the Ukrainian army can never defeat Russia. In that situation, how can the US and NATO avoid either accepting an existential world-changing defeat or entering into a direct war with Russia? And I think the way they're likely to do that is that all of these new neocon voices who have been adamantly excluding the possibility of a ceasefire, Blinken's and all, will start calling for one. They will start, in order to prevent the Russian offensive they fear once the Ukrainian army explicitly and blatantly collapses, and they're afraid of a Russian offensive, which they won't be able to stop, they will propose a concession. They will propose the ceasefire that other people have been asking for, and they have been refusing. And it will be easy for them. They have, because of what's it's been proposed by everybody else and refused by them. They will be easy to portray themselves as they're now the ones who are offering a reasonable compromise. It goes something like this. Let's stop fighting. Let's pause the fighting. Everyone go to their corners. Both sides will stop military attacks. Ukraine will stop attacking. Russia will stop attacking on the line of contact. We'll suspend indefinitely any Ukrainian request to join NATO. We won't contest Russia. We won't contest your control of Crimea and the four oblasts. We won't recognize it formally, but we won't contest it. Final status issues will be determined in a negotiated peace process. We won't attack you. You won't move your military forces 1 inch less west of line X, whatever that is, and won't interfere with the internal politics of Kiev. To make sure this ceasefire works out, that we have negotiations, not escalation, and nobody does anything to disrupt it, we will introduce a contingent of international peacekeepers and establish a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine, west of line X. And again, this is going to be them proposing and presenting themselves as the ones who want to negotiate, not escalate. To which Russia will respond, I think, something like this. Nope. We won't accept any Minsk III. We won't accept, we reject any attempt by parties who are losing, and only because they are losing, to again postpone the resolution of this conflict forever. Our objectives remain. We require the Kiev government to permanently renounce any objective of joining NATO, we require to remove any extant NATO military infrastructure, to declare itself a neutral country, to formally recognize Crimea and the four oblasts as part of Russia, and to reconfigure its political, its polity to eliminate the dominance of Russophobic, fascist, Banderite nationalism. We will also treat any international ground or air forces that introduced into or over the territory of Ukraine without our agreement as enemy combatants and legitimate military targets. So you see, I think Russia will react like that. And when they do, they will be framed as the aggressive party, unwilling to stop fighting, insisting on escalation over negotiation. I'm convinced this is the situation we're heading into. I don't think US NATO side, I think they're kind of forced to make a proposal like this. And the Russian side will not and would be foolish to accept it. The whole situation will be set up by something like the false flag explosion at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in the next few days that Ukraine is blatantly telegraphing and will probably make happen. The July 11th NATO meeting is a deadline for Kiev. With the collapse of its army, it's urgent for Kiev to get US NATO military force in Western Ukraine to maintain the regime's survival. The peacekeeper troops and air power that will come in will be loudly announced that their purpose is not to fight Russia on the lines of contact, but only to protect lives in Western Ukraine from Russian or anybody else's recklessness. That is really to protect the regime in Kiev from being overrun. So that's what the Foreign Legions and air power would be for, to the last bastion of defense of the Kiev regime. It's something, this kind of ceasefire proposal, frozen conflict, Korean-style armistice, you know, kick the can down the road, have a forever peace process like the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, even maybe a little bit like the Syrian unresolved resolution, like the Syrian situation. It's something that adjourns the quest for impossible Ukrainian victory, but avoids either the massive direct for the direct for NATO and the U.S. It avoids the quest for impossible Ukrainian victory, and also avoids either the massive direct intervention or the decisive defeat of the U.S. and NATO. So I think they're going to try something like this. I think it's also they try something like this. You know, understand the American neocons think they can control everything. They think they can turn war on and off when they want, because no one would dare keep fighting if the United States offers a ceasefire. They're partying like it's 1999. They assume their adversaries' fear and weakness. They assume Russia will stop fighting when they decide to call a timeout. I don't know, have they met Russia in 2023? I don't think they can even see it. I don't think Russia will accept a frozen conflict like this. And I think they will choose to fight on until Kiev, which means the US and NATO capitulate. Russia will reject this because Russia has already entered in good faith into successful negotiations that were undermined by the US, NATO, and Kiev. It's true that Putin has demonstrated his desire to avoid major conflict with the US and NATO, so it's possible, but extremely unlikely that he'll fall for such a gambit again. Of course, that also means that, you know, after this Ukrainian offensive fails and is over, and their army is reduced, Russia will have to shift into offensive gear. Its strategy of attrition, prioritizing destroying Ukraine's army over capturing and holding territory, has been, as Ritter, Mercouris, Roletic, etc., have said, very shrewd and successful. But killing Ukrainian soldiers is not and cannot be made out to be the point of Russia's intervention, or even the basis for entering into negotiations or accepting a ceasefire. Before entering to any negotiation process, even to create a minimally acceptable ceasefire line, Russia must soon go on the offensive and take secure control of at least all the territory it claims, since it's very unlikely Kiev will be allowed to cede that territory without being run out of it on the battlefield. You know, if the idea is we'll sit down on the table and we'll persuade them to let us come into that, you know, take over the rest of the territory, I think it would be a very foolish idea, and I don't think Russia is that foolish anymore. So really the only negotiation in this conflict will be over terms of surrender once things are settled on the battlefield. And the result will be a decisive, unallowable defeat. Russia will fight on, I think, until the capitulation of Kiev. And the US, NATO, or whatever foreign legions they enter will have to either come in as direct combatants, likely with the use of tactical nuclear weapons, or accept an existential defeat. There's another wild card here that's very dangerous, and that is the Ukrainian fascists. I don't think these are more dangerous than I think people normally talk about. Everyone understands that no government in Kiev, even if the US would allow it, will be able to make and keep the capitulatory settlement that Russia demands, unless the armed fascist forces are purged from that government. But it's also the case that no government in Kiev will be able to make and keep any kind of ceasefire or frozen conflict agreement the United States might want, unless the armed forces of Ukraine are purged from those fascist forces. Any American plan short of Ukrainian victory will be a hard sell to Ukrainian fascists. They will be in no mood to accept any long-term deferral of fighting. They are at least as eager as Russia to resolve this promptly and decisively, and they must now be as doubtful as Russia of America's long-term reliability. They have seen how America upends a country and then goes home. They can also see the growing anti-war pressure on European governments, which will extend to America's government in the next few months. People say, correctly, that the neocons don't care what happens to Ukraine or to the Ukrainian people, that they're using them just as cannon fodder against Russia. But it's also true that the fascists in Ukraine don't care what it costs the US, Europe, or even Ukraine, whom they want also to use in their war against Russia. The fascist father of the country, stepfather of the country, Stepan Bandera, said quite clearly, the complete and final victory of Ukrainian nationalism will be won only when the Russian Empire no longer exists. Ukrainian fascists want the destruction of Russia above all, and are convinced, not unreasonably, that as long as Russia is destroyed, whatever the damage to Ukraine, the United States, or Europe, they'll be left standing as a stronger political force. The aim of the Ukrainian fascists is not to pacify Russia. It is to get the United States and NATO to destroy Russia with a nuclear war if necessary. They are then, in that respect, they are the willing and even the leading partners of US neocons. They're a player in the game that the US neocons do not control as much as they like to think. This all makes the prospect of avoiding massive war very difficult. On the subject of using nukes, I just want to say quickly that, it's important to recognize the difference in nuclear doctrine, military doctrine. The United States has a much more liberal criteria for use of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, does than Russia. The United States nuclear doctrine explicitly says they'll use them to avert battlefield surprises. But the reality of it is that the actual policy for nuclear weapons use of any state that has them, and the danger to the entire world as long as any state does, is we will use nuclear weapons when we judge that it's absolutely necessary to do so. And we will determine what absolutely necessary means. The question in this situation is which party is more likely to find it absolutely necessary to use nuclear weapons to stave off what it considers an existential defeat. And I don't think, it's pretty clear to me that the only party who's in that position is the Western party, the US and NATO. Russia is not likely to be in the position of facing an existential defeat from Ukraine. And I'd just like to mention one other thing. That is, the danger of this war and the danger of what's happening and the danger of the neocon delusions. There was a great little diptych by the Saker, which I talk about in my article about warm war and Russiamania. And that is this. One, the Russians are afraid of war. The Americans are not. Two, the Russians are ready for war. The Americans are not. And I refer you to that article, and you can read what I think about that. I think it's a very important point, and it's part of the problem of fundamentally where we are now and how dangerous the situation is. We're at a greater risk of nuclear war, I think, than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Today, the two major nuclear powers are in ongoing combat. Today, the president is Joe Biden. Today, the neocons are still partying like it's 1999, continuing to believe in US omnipotence and Russian fear and weakness. Today, that is, the level of delusion is much greater. So this is why I think there's at least a 50% chance that a military situation will arise in which one of the parties in this conflict faces an imminent existential defeat that it cannot allow. That party is most likely to be the US, NATO, Kiev. And there's at least a 50% chance that the party threatened with such a defeat will use every weapon in its arsenal to stave it off. Therefore, I think there's a 50% chance of nuclear war. And if you want to argue otherwise in this war between the United States, NATO, Kiev versus Russia, you have to answer the question, who will accept defeat?